Some of the best things about D&D are the monsters, but sometimes they just don't go far enough, with great ideas just left dangling in the wind only to be picked up by morons like me. Do you know there's a monster that's just an ogre with a bug head? It's ridiculous. Which is why it's the entire basis of this video. The carrion ogre has the body of an ogre and the head of a carrion crawler, which is just a massive millipede. When I ran this creature with my party, I flavoured it as the carrion crawler itself had infected the ogre, acting as a parasite, like a supersized tapeworm. But I was not satisfied with leaving it there. So I created a series of different kinds of parasites that infect creatures classified as giants, like ogres, trolls, and giants. If you want to get the stat blocks for your game or to follow along, the link to them is in the description below. If you're watching this in the far future and they're different in the document than they are here, it's because they've been updated with playtesting, so just stick with the document. The bugs themselves have their own stats when they're roaming free without a host, but they can take over the body of any creature that is a giant. When this occurs, you use the base stats of that creature, reduce its intelligence score to that of the parasite, remove any actions that it has, and replace it with those of the parasite living within it. The only exception to this is any creature with the regeneration ability, which still suffers the intelligence reduction, but it gets to keep its base abilities. This should keep things flexible for you to make some interesting encounters, since each parasite serves one specific purpose in terms of combat and the colony. We'll be starting with the acid spitter and its stats. It's a large creature but focuses on range abilities, so its strength is at 13 and dexterity at 14. Hardly a surprise it has the ability to shoot some acid out of its face, so it needs to be fairly hardy with its constitution score up at 18, but that's a stupid way to fight enemies, so its intelligence is at 1. It makes up for it with its wisdom at 15, you need to be able to see your target to hit it, and we'll end it with 5 for charisma. They're ugly and scary, but they're not really chatty. Its main purpose is fairly self-explanatory considering I've already said it. It will be taking the ranged role of this array of body raiders with a blob of acid attack. The target must be within 30 feet and make a dexterity saving throw DC 14 or suffer 4d4 acid damage on a failed save or half on a successful one. To help with attacking at range, it has 60 feet of dark vision, proficiency in perception, giving it a +4, and keen smell, giving it advantage on perception checks based on smell. All the parasites have this proficiency and keen smell, so I won't repeat myself every time, they just have them. If your players do get close, however, it does have a bite attack that does 2d4 + 1 piercing damage, but if your players manage to get that close, chances are it won't be around for much longer. With an AC of 11 and around 57 HP, they really shouldn't be too difficult to take down, especially if you use them against more powerful parties in a horde-like fashion. Without a host, it is rather slow at 20 feet per round, but with its spider climb it can travel up difficult surfaces, walls, and even ceilings without having to make an ability check, so just move it around on the ceiling and it'll make room for more bugs. The grappler has one job, and that is to grab onto your players and never let go. So its strength is way up at 18, but making up for it with its dexterity much lower at 11. It's mostly muscle and teeth, so it can take a punch, so its constitution matches its strength at 18, intelligence is way down at 1, wisdom at 8, and charisma at 5. With its crushing jaws and 15-foot reach, it can land an attack from a way away, dealing 3d6 + 4 piercing damage and grappling the target. On subsequent turns with an action is the option to try and drag the target towards itself if said target fails a strength saving throw DC 14. If you don't want to risk the chance of success, you can always just use Crush, which inflicts 2d12 + 4 piercing damage to the grappled creature. While that's a good amount of damage, it is not guaranteed, so you have to make it worthwhile when it does happen. One way to do this is by taking advantage of the grapple to gain advantage on attacks against the grappled creature, and one that is incredibly good at that is the Scythe Parasite. This parasite has no real special abilities apart from having a shed load of attacks. 4 to be exact, each doing 1d8 + 3 slashing damage, and if you take advantage into consideration, that gives you 8 attempts to get a crit and scare your players half or completely to death. It has no ranged abilities, but without a host, it has a high movement speed of 40 feet to close the distance. If you want to make it more dangerous and up the challenge rating, give it the aggressive ability, allowing it to move its full speed towards an enemy as a bonus action. Since the parasite is just a mass of arms ending its scything claws with the sole ability of swinging them all at once without hurting itself, means it requires a certain amount of finesse. Strength is at 13 and dexterity is higher at 16, matched only by a constitution which is also at 16. Intelligence is 1, believe it or not, wisdom is at 10 and charisma is 6. It's slightly scarier than your average bug. Moving from one end of the spectrum to the other, the psionic parasite is the only caster of the group. Believe it or not, bugs find it difficult to cast with their lack of fingers. Like any full caster, strength is a dumb stat at 8, but with dexterity at 13 to help with some common saves. Constitution is a little higher at 15 to help with maintaining concentration on some spells, which brings us to Intelligence, which is much larger than the previous at 3. Mostly because its spellcasting modifier is Wisdom, which is at 16, and Charisma is at 5. Go figure. This innate spellcasting ability gives it access to second level spells with DC 13, and the spell list consists of mostly support spells. The only cantrip it gets is Mind Sliver, iconic psychic damage spell, which is a theme continued later, but not with the first level spells, which is exclusively left to Bane, which it can be cast 3 times a day. When it gets to the second level spells, the creature has 2 slots to mess around with and 3 choices to wrestle with. Acid Arrow is a nice combat option and links to the spitter discussed earlier, but you may want to start with Hold Person to make sure your players can't run away, and to finish it up you get Mind Spike, psychic damage. To cast these spells it needs to know their target is there, and these creatures are blind and thus immune to the blinded condition. To make up for it they have blind sense out to 60 feet, but only a 10-foot speed, so they are very much meant to be sentries within a colony's nest to best support the damage dealing members to deal with intruders. Keeping with this theme of defense of the nest comes the Spore Parasite. It can make a massive spore cloud that poisons those that enter it for the first time or start their turn there. It extends out to a 20-foot radius with a DC 14 Constitution save, and if the creature fails they become poisoned and suffer 2d6 poison damage, repeating the save at the end of their turn. The cloud itself also obscures the area, providing half cover to those inside, including the parasite itself, but these spores have a downside. They are pretty flammable. Parasite itself has a vulnerability to fire, but when the cloud is active the parasite becomes even more vulnerable. When the parasite is targeted by an attack or forced to make a saving throw that would inflict fire damage, the attack is done with advantage and the saving throw is made at disadvantage. Once the damage is inflicted, every creature within the cloud suffers 2d6 fire damage and the cloud burns away until it is reactivated. I think it's pretty obvious to say that this creature is immune to both poison damage and the poison condition, but you can never be too sure. It has no other combat ability, so it doesn't require high physical stats, with strength and dexterity being 12 and 11 respectively, but it has its constitution at 19 to combat said poisonous spores coursing through its body. All it has to do is stand around and turn on a cloud when bad guys get nearby, so intelligence is down at 1 where it belongs. It's also blind like the psionic, with blind sense reaching 60 feet, but its role is to defend the nest and sense intruders, so its wisdom is at a decent 12, and finishing with the usual 5 charisma. With its slower movement of 15 feet per round and a base armor class of 11 or 13 with its cloud active, it's not difficult to pin down by your ranged fighters, but in a small area like the tunnels of a nest with mostly melee combatants, it should prove a little more difficult. The last parasite is more of an exclusive since they can only infect Ettins, and this is the Feeder. The one that moves around the colony feeding each of the workers so they don't have to stop maintaining the nest. This creature carries enough food in liquid form to feed hundreds of parasites, so it needs to be pretty strong, so its strength is way up at 21. But it is also weighed by its massive food bladder. That is the worst thing I've ever said. Its dexterity is at 11. Constitution is up there at 19. It's kind of important to keep the walking vending machine alive, but as usual, intelligence is in the gutter. It needs to know the difference between friends and the wall, so hopefully the 10 and wisdom will help. Lastly is 8 in Charisma. It's a mass of tentacles stabbing into everything it comes across. It has a certain stage presence. Without a host, it is incredibly slow with 10 feet of movement, but each of its feet or tentacles has a reach of 10 feet, so it should be within range to show off the multiple uses of said tentacles. The feeder can make 6 attacks per round, and while that is a lot, any number of these attacks can be used to target a friendly parasite within range and heal them. This healing comes from a pool of hit points not dissimilar to a paladin's lay on hands, except it can be refilled by dealing damage. Half of all damage dealt is added to this pool up until it reaches 50 hit points, so when you're running it, be generous, because once your players figure it out, they will gun for it. Speaking of which, how can you run these monsters? I designed them like ants, but with horrific body possession. Each of the different abilities are meant to be used for their very specific jobs, and separately they aren't too difficult to deal with. I managed to get a great moment with my players by having them fight the ogre only for it to reveal the parasite once it hits 0 in a horrific and bloody way. It was memorable but not difficult for a party of 4 3rd level adventurers. Used in a horde with each of their abilities working together, you should be able to scare your more powerful party. Having them in smaller caverns like the home nest will mitigate the lack of ranged abilities in the more damage dealing variants. If you're thinking there are some roles we haven't covered yet, you would be right. This video is only covering the base workers and mages within this species, the creatures that are large. But things get bigger and scarier once you move up the hierarchy. That will be coming next week, or the one after.